Ben Williams had never believed in fate. He'd always been a man of logic, of systems, of calculations. But as he sat at his desk, the dusty journal in his hands felt like a relic of something beyond reason, something he hadn't thought about in decades. A half-century of engineering had taught him to expect the unexpected, but this? This was something else entirely. He felt it deep in his bones, a tingling sensation that warned him, he was holding something that would change everything. The journal had been his father's, a man Ben had once admired and loved deeply before his sudden disappearance years ago. It wasn't like his father to leave behind such cryptic writings. Yet, here it was, filled with half-drawn schematics, theories that seemed to belong to a time far ahead of their own, and strange symbols Ben had never seen before. What had his father been involved in? Why had he left all of this behind? Ben ran his fingers over the leather-bound cover, his heart racing in his chest. The past few years had been quiet for him. At 67, he'd retired from a life of intense work, opting for a peaceful existence in his rural home. But everything changed the moment he opened that journal. It wasn't just the complex formulas or the theories of human enhancement that caught his attention. It was the last entry. A simple line scrawled in his father's handwriting. The power lies in what we've forgotten. It's buried beneath us, but it will awaken when the time is right. Ben felt his heart skip a beat. Forgotten power? What was his father talking about? And why did it feel as though the world had shifted the moment those words met his eyes? As he continued reading, the words became even more puzzling, cryptic in nature, almost as if his father were speaking directly to him from the grave. Then, something strange happened. The ground beneath Ben's feet rumbled, just a slight tremor, but enough to send a ripple of unease through him. The lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, resonating through the walls, almost as if the very air had become charged. Ben shot up from his chair, his pulse racing. The quiet, predictable world he had built for himself was cracking, and something was coming through. He looked around, his mind racing. Was it possible? Could this technology, this forgotten power, really exist? His father had been involved in something far more significant than Ben had ever imagined. But why had he kept it hidden? And why was it awakening now? Ben quickly shoved the journal into his bag and headed out of his house. He needed answers. This was bigger than anything he had ever dealt with in his engineering career. It was as though the world had just opened a door to a long-lost secret, one that was now calling him to uncover it. As he reached the door, a soft knock echoed through the wooden frame. He froze, heart pounding. Who could it be? He wasn't expecting visitors. When he opened the door, standing there, shrouded in shadows, was a figure he recognized all too well. Ben, the figure said, voice low and measured. We need to talk. It was David, an old colleague from the military, someone Ben had trusted long ago. But something was different about him now. His eyes, cold and unblinking, revealed nothing of the man Ben had once known. What are you doing here? Ben asked, a mix of confusion and wariness creeping into his tone. David stepped forward, his eyes flicking toward the bag at Ben's side. You don't know what you've stumbled onto, do you? That journal your father left behind, it's not just a record. It's a map. A map to a power the world hasn't seen in centuries. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about? What power? David's gaze hardened. The technology your father discovered, it's not just about machines or gadgets. It's about humanity. It's about what we've lost. What we've forgotten. And now, it's waking up. Before Ben could respond, a sudden blinding light flashed from behind David. Ben instinctively stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for the journal in his bag. Run, David hissed, his voice urgent. They've found us. We don't have much time. Ben's mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was they? What was this power? And why was David warning him now? As the light flickered again, Ben didn't hesitate. He grabbed the journal and bolted past David, not knowing what awaited him outside, only that his life would never be the same again. Twist/cliffhanger. As Ben rushed out the door, he could hear David's voice faintly calling his name from behind, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. His mind was locked on the journal, the key to answers that were now slipping through his fingers. Just as he reached the driveway, an explosion shook the ground, and the world around him went dark. Ben collapsed to the ground, his heart racing. Everything around him felt surreal. This wasn't just a quiet discovery. This was something much bigger, and it was about to consume him. As the smoke cleared, Ben realized something shocking: the world was not ready for what was coming. And neither was he. Ben awoke in darkness. His head throbbed, and his chest ached with every breath. The world around him seemed to be shifting, groaning as if it were on the edge of collapse. Slowly, the pain in his head subsided, replaced by a deep sense of unease. He tried to move but found his body sluggish, as though his muscles had forgotten how to respond. His hand brushed against the rough ground beneath him, and he flinched, the world still a blur. His mind was racing. The last thing he remembered was the explosion, David, the journal, the strange, blinding light. Had it been an attack? Was that what David meant when he said, "They've found us"? The thought gnawed at him, sending a cold shiver down his spine. Who were they? And why was everything suddenly so wrong? As the world slowly began to focus, he realized he was no longer on the ground outside his house. Instead, he was lying on the cold floor of what appeared to be an old warehouse. It was dark, save for a few dim lights scattered across the high ceilings. He could barely make out the shadowy figures moving in the corners of his vision, but none of them seemed to approach him. Ben's chest tightened with anxiety. "Where am I?" he whispered to no one in particular, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "You're safe, for now." The voice startled Ben, and he shot up, instinctively reaching for his side. His hand met nothing but air, but the sensation of panic was overwhelming. He tried to stand but wobbled, his knees too weak to support him. A hand appeared out of the shadows, steadying him. "Take it easy," said the voice again, this time with a soothing, authoritative tone. Ben turned toward it and squinted, trying to make sense of the person standing before him. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in military fatigues, much like David. But this was not David. The stranger's face was unreadable, his eyes hidden beneath a cap. He wasn't wearing any insignia or markings, but there was something about his presence that spoke volumes. "Who are you?" Ben croaked, still trying to steady himself. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, and the journal was the only thing that seemed clear in his thoughts. It had to be with him; if it wasn't, everything would be for nothing. The stranger sighed, stepping back and allowing Ben to regain his balance. "You're awake. That's a good start." His voice was tinged with impatience but not unkind. "We don't have much time. The people after you won't stop until they get what they want." Ben's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, what they want? Who are they? What's happening?" The stranger hesitated before answering. "They are a faction that has been watching you for years, Ben. Watching your father. Watching his work. They know what you're carrying now, the journal. They've been waiting for someone to uncover it. For someone to activate it." Ben's head spun, trying to process the gravity of the situation. But what's in it? What power is so important that people would destroy everything to get it? The stranger moved toward a table near the corner, where a flickering screen illuminated a large map of the world. Ben's eyes followed the motion, his curiosity piqued. This was the first clue he had received about who might be behind the attacks. The man's next words were enough to shake him to his core. "This isn't just about technology, Ben. It's about humanity's potential. The power your father found is more than just mechanical. It's biological. And it's been dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment. The journal, it holds the key to unlocking a part of humanity that has been forgotten for so long, people are unwilling to believe it ever existed. Ben was stunned. You're saying my father, he knew how to unlock a hidden power inside of us? Something we've lost? Yes. Your father was close to it. He was the last one to understand what was coming. The power your father discovered goes beyond machines or any of the technological advancements we're used to. This is a power that taps into the very essence of humanity itself. Ben stepped forward, his heart pounding. The more he heard, the more confusing it became. What do you want from me? Why did you bring me here? The stranger's expression remained stoic. We need you to finish what your father started. We need you to unlock it. The journal is only the beginning. It's a map, yes, but it requires someone with the right knowledge, someone who understands the deeper truths your father uncovered. Ben's mind was reeling. Was this really happening? Could humanity really have once held such power? And why had it been forgotten? A series of loud, echoing thuds broke through his thoughts, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots marching. Ben instinctively pressed against the wall, his breath catching in his throat. The stranger's face darkened. "They've found us," the man muttered under his breath, drawing a sleek handgun from his side. "Stay quiet. Stay out of sight. You're not ready for this yet." Before Ben could respond, the sound of metal doors screeching open reverberated through the warehouse. He instinctively ducked, hiding behind a large crate. His mind was racing. Who were these people? What did they want with him? And why had his father been involved in something this dangerous? As the footsteps grew louder, Ben realized that his journey had only just begun. There was no turning back now. Ben's pulse thundered in his ears as he crouched in the shadows, heart racing. The footsteps were now deafening, a steady rhythm that sent waves of tension through him. He tried to keep still, forcing his breath to be as silent as possible. But as his thoughts swirled, a creeping anxiety clutched at his chest. What are they looking for? He wondered, his mind spinning. He had no answers, only questions, and a growing fear that the truth was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The soldiers moved methodically, spreading out across the warehouse. Their voices were low, but the harsh commands were clear. They were hunting for something, or someone. And Ben had no doubt he was at the top of their list. His eyes flicked to the stranger, who remained hidden behind another stack of crates. The man's face was grim, his fingers tightening around the gun. There was no doubt he was prepared for this confrontation, but Ben felt anything but ready. He barely understood what was happening, let alone how to survive it. The leader of the group, a man with cold, calculating eyes, barked an order to his men, his voice cutting through the silence. "Check the back rooms. He can't be far." Ben felt his blood run cold. "They know I'm here." The air around him seemed to vibrate with the growing tension. Every part of him wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but the thought of what might happen if they caught him kept him rooted to the spot. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time felt warped as Ben's mind cycled through possible escape plans. The soldiers were getting closer. He could hear their boots scraping against the floor as they searched, their whispers like distant echoes. Ben's thoughts kept drifting to his father. How had this all started? What had he discovered that was so dangerous? It was becoming clear that whatever had been uncovered in that journal was a weapon, something that, if placed in the wrong hands, could destroy everything. The stranger, who, as yet, hadn't revealed his name, kept his eyes trained on the soldiers. It was like he could feel the tension in the air, could sense every movement around them. Ben was starting to understand, this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for humanity's future. But then the first shot rang out. It shattered the silence like a cracking thunderstorm, loud and violent. Ben flinched, instinctively covering his ears. He heard the thud of someone hitting the ground, followed by frantic commands. "Down! Take cover," the soldier shouted. Ben's heart leapt into his throat as chaos erupted around him. The soldiers scrambled for cover, weapons raised, scanning the darkness for their unseen attacker. Ben had no idea who had fired the first shot, but the tension in the air became palpable. The stranger was already moving, ducking low and staying out of sight. Ben's instincts screamed at him to follow, but his body refused to cooperate. His legs were stiff, and his mind was too clouded with panic to think clearly. The gunfire erupted again. The sudden flashes of light illuminated the shadows, briefly revealing the faces of the soldiers. They were highly trained, their movements swift and precise as they returned fire. Ben's eyes widened in shock. One of the soldiers fell, his body crumpling to the ground in an unnatural angle. The stranger had struck. It was over in a flash, swift, calculated, and terrifying. "Get up," the stranger hissed, suddenly at Ben's side, grabbing him by the arm. "Move." Ben didn't need to be told twice. The adrenaline surged through him, and he sprang to his feet, his legs unsteady but carrying him forward. His heart pounded in his chest as the two of them ran, weaving through the maze of crates, the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears. Ben had never run like this in his life, his body felt like it was moving on instinct, as if everything else had faded away. All that mattered was survival. The stranger was ahead of him, leading the way with ease, like he'd done this 100 times before. They reached a door at the back of the warehouse, and the stranger kicked it open. They spilled out into an alley, the cold night air biting at Ben's exposed skin. He sucked in a deep breath, trying to regain control over his wild pulse. "Keep moving," the stranger snapped, his voice urgent. Ben didn't hesitate. He followed, desperate to keep pace with the man who seemed to know exactly where he was going. The alley stretched before them like an endless tunnel. Ben's mind raced as they turned a corner, ducking into the shadows of a narrow street. "We need to get to the safe house," the stranger muttered, glancing around cautiously. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Safe house? What was he talking about? Before he could ask, the sound of footsteps echoed in the alley behind them. Ben whipped around, heart in his throat. Were they being followed? Were the soldiers closing in? A flash of movement caught his eye, another figure darting into the alley. His mind went blank as a second figure approached, a familiar face from the chaos in the warehouse. One of the soldiers was closing in. Without thinking, Ben lunged forward, his instincts taking over as he grabbed a nearby pipe and swung it with everything he had. The soldier's eyes widened in surprise as Ben connected, the pipe slamming into his chest. The soldier grunted, stumbling backward, giving Ben just enough time to knock the gun from his hands. The soldier recovered quickly, lunging at Ben in a desperate move. Ben fought back, panic rising, as the two grappled. The sound of footsteps from behind signaled that the rest of the soldiers weren't far off. The stranger, seeing Ben in trouble, dove into the fray with the same calculated precision he'd shown before. The soldier was knocked to the ground, but there was no time to linger. "Run!" the stranger shouted, pulling Ben back to his feet. "Now!" The two of them bolted down the alley, racing against the noise of soldiers in pursuit. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, every step feeling like it was his last. But deep down, he knew something had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. And now, with the truth slowly starting to unravel, he was ready to find out what he was truly up against. Ben's legs burned as he pushed himself harder, each step pulling him further into a terrifying unknown. The stranger, still clutching Ben's arm, led him through the maze of alleyways with swift, determined steps. The cold air seemed to freeze the blood in Ben's veins, but it wasn't the chill that made him shiver, it was the sense that he was being pulled into something much larger than himself. The car was only a few yards away, but every step felt like an eternity. As they approached, the stranger's grip tightened, and Ben could see his knuckles turning white. The vehicle was dark, sleek, with tinted windows that reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. It looked too ordinary to be anything out of the ordinary, yet Ben felt a surge of unease. What kind of world was he being thrust into? The stranger reached for the door handle without a word. It was then that Ben noticed the logo on the car, a symbol he'd seen only once before, in his father's journals. It was the emblem of the Dominion, the organization his father had warned him about. The very group that had been hunting for the knowledge hidden in those journals. Ben's breath caught in his throat. "Get in," the stranger urged in a low, urgent voice, his eyes scanning the street behind them. Ben didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled into the back seat, his mind racing as the door slammed shut behind him. The engine roared to life, and the car shot forward, weaving through the narrow streets with the kind of speed that made Ben's stomach flip. The stranger didn't say anything as they sped through the city, but Ben could sense the weight of the moment. The silence was thick with unspoken words. "Where are we going?" Ben finally asked, his voice strained. The stranger glanced at him briefly, his eyes unreadable. The heart of it all. Ben didn't understand. The heart of what? But before he could ask further, the car made a sharp turn and pulled into a hidden entrance beneath a crumbling building. A large steel door slid open, revealing a dimly lit underground facility. The car rolled to a stop in front of a secure entrance, and the stranger quickly exited. Ben hesitated for only a moment before following, his heart pounding in his chest. The air smelled stale, the atmosphere thick with the weight of secrecy. He followed the stranger through a labyrinth of hallways, each turn feeling more claustrophobic than the last. Finally, they reached a door. The stranger entered without knocking, and Ben followed closely behind. Inside, the room was large, dimly lit, and filled with computer screens, maps, and documents scattered across the tables. A group of people sat in chairs, all of them staring at screens, typing furiously. They looked up as the stranger entered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. One woman stood up immediately, a tall, sharp-eyed figure who wore an expression of quiet authority. "He's here," she said, her voice low but commanding. Ben looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had been waiting for him. They weren't just any ordinary group, they were highly trained, disciplined, and intense. The air was thick with tension. "Ben, this is Sarah," the stranger said, motioning to the woman. "She's one of the few who knows the full scope of what's at stake here." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes scanning Ben with a critical look. "We don't have much time," she said bluntly. "The Dominion is closing in, and we need to move quickly. But before we do, you need to understand something." Ben's stomach twisted. He felt the weight of her words like a stone sinking into his gut. "Understand what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The truth about your father," Sarah said, her tone softening just a little. "And the power he uncovered." A heavy silence hung in the air as the words sank in. Ben's pulse raced, and his mind whirled. His father? What did this have to do with him? Sarah continued. "Your father was part of a group, a secret faction within the Dominion. They uncovered an ancient artifact, one that holds the key to unimaginable power. But they were betrayed, and your father disappeared before he could finish his work. Now, the Dominion is after that power, and they'll stop at nothing to find it." Ben's heart pounded in his chest. His father had known about this? He felt the weight of the revelation sink in. His father hadn't just been running away from something, he had been protecting something far bigger than Ben had ever imagined. "You're in danger, Ben," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "They know you're the key to everything. They'll come for you." Ben nodded slowly, trying to process everything. Danger? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they were far more complicated than he could have imagined. His father's disappearance, the journals, the Dominion, they all led to this moment. Sarah motioned to a large table at the center of the room, where a map of the world was spread out, dotted with red markers. The Dominion is closing in on several key locations where your father's research might lead. We need to get ahead of them before they find it. Ben swallowed hard, his mind racing. What do I need to do? Sarah's eyes softened for the first time. You need to trust us. Trust me. Your father's work, it's our only chance to stop them. Ben hesitated for a moment, the weight of the world bearing down on him. He thought of his father, the man who had always been a mystery to him. The man who had disappeared without a trace. And now, in his absence, Ben was left to pick up the pieces of a dangerous legacy. But one thing was clear, he wasn't alone anymore. With the strangers, no, allies, around him, Ben understood that his life had changed forever. The truth was no longer a vague memory, it was alive, and it was waiting for him to uncover it. We'll fight back, Sarah said, her voice determined. But only if you're ready. Ben met her gaze. He was ready. For his father. For the truth. And for humanity's forgotten might. Ben's heart slammed against his chest as he stared at the man in the doorway. There was no mistaking it, this was his father. But his appearance was off. The man who had once been a loving, somewhat distant father was now more like a shadow of the man Ben had known. His father's eyes were cold, calculating, and there was something about his presence that was almost unnatural. Ben's mind raced. How could this be? The man stepped into the room, his gaze sweeping over the group, settling for just a brief moment on Ben. His face was gaunt, hollowed by time and strain, and his once steady hands now trembled ever so slightly. Ben, the man spoke, his voice flat, like a distant echo of the father Ben had once known. You've come further than I expected. Ben stood frozen, his mouth dry. His father was supposed to be gone, dead even, how was he standing in front of him now? It didn't make sense. I thought you were dead, Ben finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. How? How is this possible? The man nodded slowly, his lips curling into a thin, emotionless smile. Not dead, Ben. But not alive in the way you remember either. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence as everyone stared at the man. The stranger, Sarah, and the others didn't make a move, their expressions unreadable. What do you mean? Ben's voice cracked, desperation seeping in. Where have you been? Why didn't you tell me? The father's gaze softened just the slightest bit, but only for a moment. He stepped forward, each step heavy with an air of authority that made the walls feel smaller. He paused directly in front of Ben, his eyes searching his son's face. I had to disappear, Ben, he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that felt both foreign and familiar. The Dominion. They didn't just want the knowledge I found. They wanted me, and they would have stopped at nothing to get it. To protect you, I faked my death. But it wasn't enough. They've found you now. Ben could barely keep his thoughts straight, the world spinning around him. He tried to process what his father was saying, but the pieces wouldn't fit together. Why are you here now? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. His father took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the rest of the room. I've been part of something much bigger than you can imagine. Something that doesn't just concern us, but humanity's future. The knowledge I discovered. Its power, Ben. And the Dominion. They wanted to reshape the world. But why didn't you tell me this before? Ben asked, frustration building in his voice. All these years, and you kept this from me? His father's expression hardened. It was never safe. You weren't ready. And neither was I, not until now. He paused, his face twisted in conflict. I tried to keep you safe, but the time has come. There's no more hiding. Ben clenched his fists, trying to steady his shaking hands. I'm not a child anymore. I can handle the truth. His father studied him for a long moment before nodding, as if reaching some kind of decision. You're right, Ben. You're no longer the boy I left behind. And now, we have to face the Dominion. We don't have much time. Ben felt a mix of anger, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite put into words. His father had never been a perfect man, but the distance between them had always felt more like a slow, gradual drift, until now. Now it felt like a chasm. What is it you need from me? Ben asked, his voice steady now, though his thoughts churned in the background. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something huge. His father's gaze darkened. Your father's work is far from over, Ben. The Dominion has been hunting for the key to unlock it, and now they've found us. They know about the artifact, the one I uncovered. The one I hid. Ben shook his head. Artifact? What are you talking about? His father closed his eyes briefly, like he was considering how to explain the unexplainable. When he opened them, there was a finality in his eyes. The artifact is an ancient relic, more powerful than any weapon or technology we've ever known. Whoever controls it controls the fate of humanity. Ben's blood ran cold. The weight of the words hit him hard. So, they're after that? He gestured at the group, feeling as though a veil of understanding was finally lifting. What does this have to do with me? Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Your father's research pointed to you, Ben. You are the key to unlocking its final secrets. The Dominion knows that too. Ben stared at her, his mind reeling. Me? He was just a regular guy, what could he possibly have that was so important? Ben, his father said, his voice softer now, but tinged with urgency, you've been part of this from the start. Your connection to the artifact is deeper than you realize. And the Dominion won't stop until they have you, or the knowledge you carry. Ben swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt like he was standing in the middle of a storm he couldn't control. His father's sudden return, the knowledge of the Dominion, the artifact, it was all too much. We need to move now, Sarah urged, her voice cutting through the haze of confusion. Without another word, Ben turned and followed the group as they moved deeper into the facility. But as he walked, his mind was consumed with one burning question. Was he ready for the truth? The sound of gunfire echoed down the narrow corridor, a sharp reminder of how close they were to the edge of disaster. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as he sprinted alongside Sarah, his father, and the others, desperately trying to stay ahead of the chaos. The corridor felt like it was closing in, the walls seemingly shrinking as the distant shouts of the Dominion soldiers grew louder. Move! Sarah yelled, urgency lacing her voice. We can't outrun them forever. Ben felt the adrenaline surge through his veins. His legs burned with the effort, but the weight of his father's words, the knowledge of what they were running toward, kept his pace steady. He could hardly think straight. The artifact. The Dominion. His father. Everything was happening too quickly, and Ben was struggling to keep up, let alone understand the full scope of what was at stake. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a heavily secured room, its walls lined with thick metal doors. At the center stood a large steel vault, its lock a puzzle of technology Ben couldn't begin to comprehend. This is it, his father said, his voice low but intense. He approached the vault, his fingers hovering over the keypad. The artifact is inside. Ben's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. He had expected the artifact to be some kind of weapon or relic, but from the way his father spoke about it, it seemed like it was far more than that. Could it really control humanity's fate? We don't have much time, Sarah said, glancing over her shoulder. The sound of footsteps was growing louder, too loud to ignore. His father nodded, quickly inputting a series of commands. The vault door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, darkened chamber inside. At the center of the room was an object covered in layers of cloth, as though it were being protected from even the air itself. Ben stepped forward, drawn by an invisible force. His father hesitated before removing the final layer, revealing a glowing sphere, smooth, iridescent, and humming with an energy that made Ben's skin prickle. The artifact was smaller than he expected, no bigger than a baseball, but its presence was overwhelming. "Is this it?" Ben whispered, awe and fear mixing in his voice. The sphere seemed to radiate power, its glow flickering like a heartbeat. "What does it do?" His father's face was taut, his eyes wary. "It's more than a weapon, Ben. It's a key, unlocking the potential of humanity. The Dominion wants to use it to control everything. But if they succeed," his voice trailed off, as though he couldn't bear to say the words. Before Ben could ask anything more, the room trembled, a distant explosion rattling the walls. The door behind them slammed open, and the first of the Dominion soldiers rushed in. Ben's instincts kicked in before he could think, grabbing the artifact from the table and clutching it tightly. He felt a surge of energy course through him, not unlike the adrenaline of the chase, but far stronger. It was as though the artifact was reaching out to him, recognizing him as its rightful holder. "We need to go, now," Sarah shouted, already pulling Ben toward the door. Her voice was sharp, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and determination. "We can't stay here." Ben turned to his father, who was already facing the soldiers, standing his ground. "Go," his father yelled. "I'll hold them off. You need to get the artifact out of here." "No, I'm not leaving you." Ben protested, but his father's face was resolute. "Go, Ben. You've got what they want. You're the only one who can stop them now." Ben hesitated for just a moment, but the urgency in his father's voice left no room for argument. "I'll come back for you," Ben promised, though he knew it was a lie. There was no coming back. Not if they didn't get out now. With one final, lingering glance at his father, Ben followed Sarah out of the vault, the door slamming shut behind them with a final, deafening clang. The sounds of gunfire erupted in the distance as they raced through the corridors, the artifact still pulsing with an energy that seemed to match the beat of Ben's heart. They reached the surface and found themselves in the middle of a war zone. The Dominion had already set up barricades, soldiers swarming the grounds as explosions rocked the earth beneath their feet. They were surrounded. Ben's mind raced. They were trapped, and yet, it felt as though the artifact in his hand was more than just a key. It felt like a shield, a promise that they weren't alone in this fight. "We're not making it out of here alive," Sarah said, her voice grim. She pulled out a small communication device and began speaking rapidly into it, trying to make contact with their allies. "The Dominion's already here. There's no way we can outrun them." Ben clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the artifact. He had to do something. He couldn't just give up. Then, a thought crossed his mind. He had no idea how the artifact worked, but if it truly held the power to reshape humanity's future, then maybe it could help them now. He looked at Sarah. "Get down," he ordered, his voice shaking with determination. He wasn't sure what would happen, but he couldn't let them be captured. "Not now." Sarah hesitated, but before she could respond, Ben raised the artifact, pointing it toward the sky. A blinding light exploded from the sphere, flooding the battlefield with a pulse of energy so strong it knocked both of them to the ground. The Dominion soldiers faltered, confusion spreading through their ranks. Ben's body hummed with power, the artifact's glow growing stronger, until it felt as though the very fabric of reality was warping around him. The soldiers began to retreat, falling back in fear as if they were facing something beyond their comprehension. Ben stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the artifact in his hands, a newfound understanding dawning in his mind. The power wasn't just for destruction, it was a force that could protect, a force that could shape the future in ways he never imagined. He turned to Sarah, who was staring at him in disbelief. "What just happened?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ben's eyes hardened, his grip tightening on the artifact. We fight. We fight for humanity."